Says yes? Okay, good. Well, thanks for coming. There's a saying that they tell people who want to play music in Texas. They say, if you're going to play in Texas, you better have a fiddle in the band. And I know that if you're going to talk about Texas history, sooner or later, you're going to have to talk about the Rangers. And so that's what we're here tonight for. Now, those of you who grew up in Texas, you probably know most of the story, you know all the legends, you know, we've heard them since we've been this high. But if you're not from Texas, you don't talk about the Rangers that much anymore, so I don't know, maybe some of you don't know too much about them. Anyway, tonight, we're going to talk about the Texas Rangers. And they started early, so you know, Stephen F. Austin brought the first group of Americans to colonize in Texas, and he came in 1823, and they settled down along the lower, between the Brazos and the Colorado rivers, down by the coast. And that was near where the Karanko Indians were living at that time. And those Indians saw opportunity with these new settlers, and so they had some pretty early on raids where they would come into somebody's new house and steal their horses and cattle and stuff, and it was a problem. So we had no army at that time. We were just a state, not even a state really yet, but a state of Mexico. And so we had no protection. Well, Austin raised a militia. And he formed two companies of 8 to 10 men each. And he says he formed them to act as rangers for the common defense. And so that's where, in 1823, is where the first name of the Texas Rangers came from. Stephen F. Austin called them that. The Karankas, by the way, were kind of interesting Indians. There's a watercolor of them by a Mexican general who came through in 1828. They were especially tall for Indians, maybe 6 feet tall or so, and they carried this really long bow, and they lived all along the coast, and they were Karankas, and they were around for a while. At any rate, that's where the Rangers got started. The Come and Take It battle at Gonzales happened in October of 1835, and so we start the Texas Revolution. We hadn't won it yet, but we got started. In November, they had what they called a General Council, where the Americans who were living in Texas at that time met and decided on some things that they needed to do in preparation for what they hoped would become a new republic. So they authorized 3 companies of Texas Rangers in November of 1835. It was 56 men in each company. They paid them $1.25 a day, and that $1.25 was supposed to cover their food, their clothes, and their horses. They had to provide their own horses. They enlisted for 1 year, and their role during the rest of the Revolution was to protect the settlers against the Indians. So that was the first official authorization. So Texas wins its independence from Mexico at San Jacinto, and the first 2 years of our republic, we were doing a lot of things to get started, and so we created companies of Rangers. Now we're back up to 260. Mounted men, mounted riflemen is a key. We never had an infantry of Texas Rangers. They were always men on horses with guns. This first group, they served for 6 years, and they were sent out to what was the frontier at that time. These towns along really an unsettled region, San Patricio, Goliad, Gonzales, Refugio, they were pretty isolated. And at that time, the Karankas were already leaving, and the problem that we were having was with Comanches. And we had problems with Comanches for a long time. And so that first group of Rangers down along the Nueces River in that area, they were mostly protecting against Comanches. George Catton was a famous artist. He came through Texas in 1835. He painted several pictures of different Indian groups. That's one of his pictures of Comanches. They were probably the best light cavalry the world has ever seen. I mean, they were really, really good on a horse. And and they could even lean over to the side so you couldn't see them and shoot their bow across the top of the horse, and you couldn't see them to shoot at them. So that's who the Rangers were particularly protecting against raids from for those settlers down there. Okay, 1840 comes along, and we had probably the biggest single battle between American Texians, I'll call them, and Comanches. It started off a year before in San Antonio with something they call the Council House fight. It's supposed to be a peace treaty. A bunch of Comanches came in, they met with a bunch of Americans in San Antonio, and the issue was captive Texas children that the Comanches had taken. They had several of them, they only brought one, and they got in a big argument over that one, and ended up in a big fight. Several of the Comanches were killed. They didn't like that, and so they retaliated a year later by sending about 600 of them all the way down to the coast. They went past Victoria, they attacked Victoria, they killed 13 people in Victoria, and they went down to the coast in a town whose name was Linville at that time. That's Port Lavaca today. So they went to Linville, and there were some, it was a port, there were some warehouses there. They wiped out Linville, stole everything, and were heading back to their homes in Central Texas, and they were surprised en route by a Texas Ranger named Ben McCulloch. He organized several volunteers, and they ambushed this group of Comanches near Lockhart, on Plum Creek in Lockhart. So they had a big battle, and those Texians won resoundingly. They estimate that 150 Comanches were killed and 7 Texans were killed. That's the biggest single battle between Indians and settlers in Texas, and the Rangers were the main ones who were leading that. So we have a republic and we have early statehood. Sam Houston was the president in 1842. He sends a bunch of Rangers down to that same southern frontier that we looked at a while ago. It's called the Nueces Strip, a piece of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Texas claimed it as theirs, but the Mexicans thought it was theirs too. So there was a lot of dispute in the Nueces Strip. Deef Smith, who was another big Texan, he recruited some Rangers. They patrolled in the same area. And then in 1846, we had the war between the United States and Mexico. Several groups of Rangers fought in that war, not as soldiers in the Army, but as independent groups of Rangers. They were scouts, they were guides, they were guerrilla fighters for the U.S. Army, and they played key roles in virtually every battle that occurred during that war with Mexico. And in Monterey, which is a particularly bad place, one of the eyewitnesses wrote this. He said it was a terrible sight to witness the Texans. Adopted to their own mode of fighting, they soon broke into the shut-up houses. They scaled walls, appeared on the housetops, and whenever a Mexican displayed himself, the deadly fire of the rifle brought him down. So they were pretty bad folks. The Mexicans called them Los Diablos Tejanos, the Devil Texans. And that's what they looked like when they were riding into Monterey. They're up front and they're just about to get in the big fight. So Los Diablos are the Texas Rangers. Here is probably the most famous of all the Texas Rangers. He's a really legend. Jack Hayes. Now you look at him and he doesn't fit the mold at all. He was a little short guy. He was 5'9", fair complected, very mild-mannered. You would have never expected him to be the person he was as a Texas Ranger. Came to Texas when he was, 13, 14 years old. Sam Houston made him a ranger. He quickly became a leader and a fearless fighter. A couple of instances that he was out on a scout, and he got surprised by a group of Comanches between Fredericksburg and Llano at Enchanted Rock. Some of you may be familiar with Enchanted Rock. It's a great big granite mound, and that's a picture of it. So these Comanches are just about to get Jack, and he has enough presence of mind to climb to the top of Enchanted Rock. And it's just a bare rock. You can see on all sides and he held off the Indians so long that they finally gave up and left. So he survived the Battle of Enchanted Rock, and he was accompanied by an Apache. It's kind of interesting. The Apaches ended up siding with the Americans early on. They were totally opposed to the Comanches, so they helped the Texans against the Comanches. And a Lepon Apache chief worked with Jack Hayes. Another early story about Hayes and his group, Samuel Colt invented a pistol up in New England, and he called it the Patterson Colt in 1839. Texas bought the first 180 of those pistols and brought them down here. Oops, thank you. It says I've lost my sound, and she's right. Thanks, Ruth. Where was I? Oh yeah, the Patterson Colt. Okay, so now the Rangers have got this 6-shooter. Well, the Indians didn't understand 6-shooters. They knew that the Texans carried pistols that had one shot, and they carried rifles that had one shot. And so when they would encounter some Texans, they'd kind of egg them on and hope the Texans would shoot once at them, and then they'd rush in real fast and shoot them with arrows before the Texans could reload their single shot pistol or rifle. Well, here comes Jack Hayes and this group of Rangers at a place called Walker's Creek up here in 1844. The Comanches surprised them. They got the Texans to shoot at them one time. The Comanches riot in with their arrows, and there's 5 more shots in every pistol. And that didn't go well for the Comanches. So they soon learned that this new Colt pistol was a bad deal. So that's the Rangers using the first Colt 45. Matter of fact, a guy named Sam Walker, who was a Texas Ranger, went up to New England, visited with Colt, and told him how to modify that pistol so that it would work a whole lot better for the Texas Rangers. He did that, and they produced what's known as the Walker's Colt, and that became probably one of the most famous early pistols in the country, the Walker's Colt. Now, Jack Hayes moved to California in 1849. He founded the city of Oakland. You know, that's right next to San Francisco. Well, that city was founded by a former Texas Ranger, Jack Hayes. Okay, here's the best book that there exists for Texas Rangers. Walter Prescott Webb was a famous historian. He wrote this book. It was forwarded by President Johnson. Anyway, Webb in there says that in the words of an observer, the Texas Ranger could ride like a Mexican, excuse me, trail like an Indian, shoot like a Tennessean, and fight like a devil. That's not the only person that described it that way. Okay, Texas becomes a state. Now Texas isn't in charge of policing the frontier anymore. It's the U.S. Army. They don't do a very good job of that. They were having problems. They were unable to stop the Indian raids, or unwilling for a while and then unable. And so it was a big problem. So several governors asked the U.S. government, would they send money to let Texas hire some Rangers? And the government said, no, we're not going to give you any money. There's limited state support. So not too much happened with respect to Rangers in that 10-year period after statehood. But that all changed around 1858. And that year, there was a Mexican bandit named Juan Cortina. And he decided that he was going to gather a group of men down there, and they were going to take that Nueces Strip back from Texas and give it to Mexico. So he starts a big commotion in South Texas. He takes over Brownsville. He occupies Brownsville. They send for help to Austin. And it turns out there was a man living in Austin named Rip Ford. He had been a former Texas Ranger, but at this time he owned a newspaper in Austin. So he's running a newspaper in Austin. And they said, Rip, you gotta go. And so Rip organizes a group of 100 volunteers Texas Rangers, and they went down to Brownsville and soundly defeated Juan Cortina and kept that Nueces Strip for Texas. So everything kind of below Corpus Christi down to the Rio Grande is, among other things, attributed to Rip Ford. He was a Confederate. There's his picture in 1858 in his Ranger uniform. They didn't have uniforms. That's the clothes he wore. And then he was a Confederate soldier. That's the picture at the bottom. And he wrote about those Rangers. He said a large proportion of them were unmarried. A few of them drank intoxicating liquors. And still, it was a company of sober and brave men. They knew their duty and they did it. While in town, they made no braggadocio demonstration. They did not gallop through the streets, shoot, and yell. They had a species of moral discipline which developed moral courage. They did right because it was right. That's what Rip Ford thought about his men that he took down to Texas, down to Brownsville. Okay, the Civil War comes along, and there were no real groups of Texas Rangers in the Civil War, but there was the 8th Texas Cavalry, and that was organized by a guy named Benjamin Franklin Terry, lived fairly near Houston. He organized a group of former Texas Rangers, and they became Confederate soldiers known as Terry's Texas Rangers, and they fought spectacularly in virtually every one of the major battles in the Civil War. There's somebody drew a picture of them at Shiloh where they're going against a group of Union soldiers. And one thing about these Rangers, they loved to have pictures taken of themselves. And this is a group of Terry's Texas Rangers during the Civil War. And there they are, all dressed up. They're not carrying their guns like you'll see them carrying in a later time, but for some reason they just love to take pictures of themselves. So the Civil War ends, and we go through this period we call Reconstruction. That's where those Yankees came down and ran things in Texas for a few years. And those people reconstituted the state police and called them Texas Rangers. And people actually joined. So we had Texas Rangers who were state police charged with enforcing these carpetbaggers laws that those outsiders put on the people of Texas. And as you can guess, that was most unpopular with the majority of the people that lived here. There was a brief period of time where we did not like Texas Rangers, but that all ended in 1873. And then Texas again takes over its own business, and we formed Rangers into what we called the Frontier Battalion. And that lasted for about 25 years, probably the most famous period of time for Texas Rangers in the state. We created 6 companies in 1874, 75 men in each company. We sent them out wherever they were needed. They had their headquarters here in Austin. They were like an army with respect to the Indians. They weren't peace officers. In the settled parts of the state, they acted much like a sheriff or a peace officer would, but out on the frontier, they were an army fighting the Indians. They were called in whenever whichever local group was having a problem could not handle it. So if there was a problem going on somewhere and they couldn't take care of it, they would call in the Texas Rangers. They did things like taming the Nueces Strip, back to the Nueces Strip again, Sam Bass Wars, we're going to talk about Sam Bass, and the barbed wire wars, which were kind of interesting, and several other things they were involved in. So here's some more pictures. Company F, Frontier Battalion, 1884, Company D, 1894. They loved to take group photographs. They always had their rifle, their Colt 45, and their Bowie knife at all times when they took those pictures. Now, during this period of time, one of the Rangers was a guy named Ira Ayton. And he decided, they didn't have uniforms, as you can see, and he decided that a badge would be nice. And so he got a Mexican 8 reales silver coin. That's a silver dollar that we know it as. And he took that silver coin and he hammered it flat, and he got a chisel of some kind, and he chipped out some little triangles, and he created the very first Texas Rangers badge. Just a homemade thing out of a coin, and he wore it, and off and on several other Rangers wore that badge. And time passed, and in 1961, it became the official badge of the Texas Rangers. At this point in time, the 1 ounce silver coin, the silver dollar, was 5 pesos, so it's a 5 peso. That's the coin that it's done. And so ever since 1961, this is the official badge of the Texas Rangers. Here's another picture. This is outside of San Saba. I don't know what they're doing, but it's the same story. They're all gathered together and they're taking pictures of themselves. They got their guns and all their goods. The guy standing up there is Ira Ayton. He's drinking a cup of coffee. And he does not have his badge on, as I can see right there. I don't know whether he forgot it that day or invented it later on or whatever, but there's a typical group of Rangers out on patrol in 1885 near San Saba. Okay, another famous Texan, Leander McNelly, born in West Virginia, came to Texas in 1860, in the Civil War, became a captain. After the war, he moved to his home, which was in Washington County, near Brenham. And they were having more problems down in South Texas, continued to, so he organized a group of volunteers from near Brenham in Washington County, and for 3 years they fought in South Texas. They did several things successfully. We had a big feud called the Sutton-Taylor feud between two families which were fighting like Hatfields and McCoys. You all have heard of them. Well, we had the Sutton-Taylor feud, and it was bad. There were lots of people that got killed in that feud. McNelly and his men broke up the feud. There was a really tough outlaw down there near Carrizo Springs named King Fisher. He got King calmed down, and there was a problem with Mexicans coming across the Rio Grande into Texas, stealing a bunch of horses and cattle, and then taking them back into Mexico. And that didn't sit well with the people who had their cattle stolen. So McNelly, totally against the law, takes his Rangers and they ride across the Rio Grande on several occasions. They went to those ranches and they got the cattle and they herded them back to Texas and gave them back to the people who did that. Now McNelly today is a controversial figure. He had a tough reputation. They say he was bad about intimidation, torture, and liberal use of violence. And it's probably true. It doesn't meet our standards today, but it sure did the job 150 years ago. So here's a little painting of McNelly down in the Nueces Strip. That's him on the white horse. There's one of his sergeants. He's got his badge on, and they have caught a cattle thief. So there is a cattle thief, and I don't know why he's dressed up so nicely, but they've got him on his horse. They got a rope around his neck. It's tied to a tree limb, and they're about to deliver frontier justice to that cattle thief. And there's all kinds of stories like that about Leander McNelly. There's a guy who wrote a book that said, "Follow me to hell." We'll take Texas Rangers down to the Nueces Strip. These Texas Rangers grew up to be old men. There's the last surviving McNelly Ranger, George Durham. Lived in Texas. The picture was taken in 1922. You'll notice that he's still got his badge on. To the last day of his life, he was very proud of being a Texas Ranger. Okay, we had the Salt Wars in 1877. Out near the Guadalupe Mountains, there were a series of shallow lakes, I'll call them, lagoons, salt flats, where pure salt basically existed on the surface. And for years and years, the Indians and the Mexicans and then the American settlers would go out there with a wagon and load it up with salt and bring it back home again because they needed salt. And it was just free for the taking. Well, this judge out in El Paso bought 320 acres of it and decided he was going to make money with it. So he fenced it off and started collecting fees. Well, people got really mad about that. And they had a riot in El Paso. They put the judge in jail for what he did. He got out and he ended up killing the guy that was against him. So they had lots of problems in El Paso over the salt. El Paso calls for the Rangers, and the Rangers wrote a report back to Austin that said civil authorities are powerless in El Paso. No one can step in. We've got to have the military out here. Life and property are in danger, and will be so until the military comes. And the mob is quiet, but they're organized and unyielding. And they were that. They laid siege to not only the judge, but also the Rangers, and they convinced both those groups that they better just give up. And so the judge surrendered and stayed alive, and the Rangers were allowed to leave unarmed. They made them leave their guns in El Paso, and they sent them home. That may be the only time the Rangers had to walk away from a fight, but it happened in El Paso. The Army finally arrived, and they put down the salt rebellions, but the Rangers were there, but didn't do the job that time. Okay, here's Sam Bass. Born in Indiana, became an orphan, moved to Texas when he was, 19, up in Denton, worked for the sheriff up there, got involved in a cattle trail herd going north, took some cows from Montana, got paid for running the cows up there just about the time there's a gold rush in the Black Hills. So he decides he's going to get rich quick. He goes to the Black Hills, and he spends all his money, and he's totally broke. And he says, all right, I know how to fix that. He starts robbing stagecoaches. And he was quite successful at it. And he got a little gang, and in 1877, they robbed a train in Nebraska in the largest train robbery that ever happened. That was Sam Bass's group. They got $60,000 in gold. They split it 6 ways. Sam comes back to North Texas, blows all his money, and he's broke again. And he does the only thing he knows how to do. He forms a gang, and they start robbing stagecoaches and trains up by Dallas. Well, that wasn't too good. They sent the Rangers after him. They didn't catch him right away. They got the Pinkertons involved, and it was a period of time where the Rangers were trying to catch Sam Bass, but they hadn't done it successfully. So in April of 1878, this is a picture of Bass in the middle and 2 of his buddies. One of them is a guy named Jim Murphy. Bass and his group were all at Murphy's house, and the Rangers surprised them there, and they got in a gunfight, and they actually wounded Sam Bass, but they didn't kill him, and he got away. And it must not have been a really bad wound, because this was in April, and in July they were going to rob a bank in Round Rock. Well, Murphy, the Rangers were going to arrest his father and put him in jail, and he didn't want that to happen. And he knew what was going to happen with Sam Bass, so he snitched. He told the Rangers, look, on such and so a day, we're going to go into Round Rock and rob a bank. So the Rangers knew what was going to happen. They go into Round Rock. They got inside a Koffel's general merchandise store next to the bank, and they waited. Sure enough, here comes Bass and 2 of his buddies. They come into town, They're getting ready to rob the bank. A deputy sheriff accosts them. They kill the deputy sheriff in the middle of the street, and then the Rangers run out of the building, and a big gunfight takes off. There's the three bad guys running, and here's the Rangers over there shooting at them. The Rangers shot both Bass and one of his buddies, Barnes, and both those two men died. Bass died the next day, and Barnes was killed on the spot. So that's the bank robbery attempt in Round Rock where the Rangers stopped Sam Bass. Okay, barbed wire. In the 1870s, Texas had a whole lot of open land that hadn't been claimed by anybody yet. And if you wanted to buy land, it was really cheap, but it was very expensive to fence it. You had to pile up rocks and a bunch of other stuff. And so they had very few fences, and a lot of people were grazing their cows on what they call the open range, just going wherever they wanted to with their cattle to let them graze. And a guy in Illinois named Joseph Glidden changed that story. He invented what we know as barbed wire. There's a picture of barbed wire. He got a patent on it in 1874. And he sends this guy, Henry Sandberg, to Texas, and said, I think they will buy a lot of that barbed wire down there. Why don't you sell them barbed wire? And Glidden did. He sold a whole lot of it. And all of a sudden, fencing began to exist in Texas. And that was a big problem for those ranchers who wanted to run their cattle on the open range. There was lots of opposition, particularly in the central Texas and northern counties that hadn't been settled yet very well. That's a picture of Glidden in front of his house. He lived in Austin. That's his house in Austin. He sold a lot of barbed wire. Brown County, where Brownwood is, was kind of a hot spot. They had a lot of unfenced public land that had not been given out yet in the 1860s. They estimate there were something like 40,000 cattle in Brown County that were just running on the open range in 1880. Well, the state started granting some of this unoccupied land to farmers and small ranchers who immediately began to erect fences. Well, that was a real problem with these other guys. And so the fence cutting started. The cutters would go out and just chop up a fence that somebody had built so they could go in and run their cattle on his land. There's a picture of Brownwood in 1880. Here is a note from a Brownwood farmer who says, I need help. He had two small pastures. He said the fences have been cut down and broken. They've said that they're going to kill my stock, they're going to poison my cows, they're going to kill me and my family, they're going to blow our house up with dynamite, and a bunch of other bad things they said they're going to do to them. And this farmer says, we think that one man of the proper kind would be sufficient. And we've been informed that you have that proper kind of man among the Rangers. So please send some Rangers to Brownwood. They did, and here is a note that these fence cutters nailed on a post that somebody had just built a fence. First, they shot the post full of bullets, and they nailed this note on it, and the note says, if you don't spool your wire and stop the fence, you will get just what the post got. We mean business. We don't intend to let any fence in this county stand, and if you think we don't mean business, just go on with your fence. And so this is a real note that was warning these farmers and ranchers that were building fences, you better stop. In 1883, the people who were for the open range and against the fence cutters had a big meeting in Brownwood to decide what you're going to do about these people that are building fences. That's a picture of that meeting. There was a lot of people involved in it. The Rangers had hired the Pinkertons, and there's an invoice from the Pinkertons wanting $100 from the Rangers for some detective work that they had done to try to help out. Now, William Adams was a sheriff of Brown County at that time, and he sided with the Open Rangers. He was against the fence cutters. No, I'm sorry, the other way around. He supported the fence cutters against the Open Rangers. The Rangers wanted to figure out what was going on. So one of theirs, a guy named William Collier, who was a ranger, he went in as an undercover agent, and he got involved with those fence cutters, and he found out what they were going to do. Well, he tells the Rangers, and they knew that at one particular night, these fence cutters are going to go out to somebody's place, and they're going to cut all this fence down. So the Rangers went out there, Company F went out there, and they hid. The fence cutters came, and they got in a big battle, and the Rangers shot 2 of the fence cutters and killed 1 of them. And there's the Frontier Battalion at that point in time. And, William Scott here was the captain. And another group picture and all of their guns, as they usually had. Now, Sweetwater is not very far away, same story. They had the same problem with fence cutters. They sent in Benjamin Warren to see if he could fix it. The fence cutters assassinated Warren, and there's his tombstone in Sweetwater today, so it didn't go very well in Sweetwater. And then there's a place called Green Lake in Edwards County, which is also nearby in kind of north central Texas. This was, as you can see, it's a natural water hole, so it's a perfect spot where everybody wanted to be able to get to water their cattle. Well, Joseph Greer bought the land and he fenced it off, and nobody liked that. So sure enough, they had another big fight out there between the Rangers and the fence cutters, and the Rangers killed one of the fence cutters at Green Lake. So they had lots of these little battles all around. And here's our friend Ira Ayton again. He's the guy that invented the badge. He is out there in that period of time. He's trying to stop the fence cutters, and he's having a hard time doing it. His boss was a guy named Lamar Seeker. Lamar was the boss here in Austin. So Ayton sends a letter to his boss, and he says, I have only one more chance, any hopes of stopping fence cutting in this section, and that's with my dynamite boom, as I call it. Well, a dynamite boom that he made, he took a shotgun and he stuffed a barrel full of dynamite. He cocked the thing, he hid the gun, tied the trigger with a string to the fence, and the idea was when these fence cutters came and fooled around with the fence, it's going to pull the trigger and the dynamite's going to go off and kill the fence cutters. There's no information I can find whether he ever used that or not, but it sounds pretty bad to me. Dynamite boom. Here's our friend Ira Ayton again. This is after the wars are over with. There he is on his horse, and as you can see, he's got his rifle in a saddle, he's got a 6-shooter, and he's got his Bowie knife like they always had. All right, the way this all got solved is our governor, who was John Ireland at the time, he calls a special session of the Texas legislature. They passed a law in February of 1884 that made fence cutting a felony. And it worked. It didn't take long, and the fence cutters put down their wire nippers. The ranch owners were required to build a gate every 3 miles so they could let cattle get through. And so after about 1884, the violence subsided, and it wasn't so bad. If you want to read about that, this is a good friend of mine named Harold Jobes. He just published his book, and it's really good about barbed wire wars. The picture that he's got on the front is the main house at the XIT ranch. And that's this big ranch up in the Texas Panhandle. lasted for a few years, 200 miles long, parts of 10 counties, 150,000 cattle on it at once, huge ranch. They needed a lot of barbed wire, and there's a wagon full of spools of barbed wire in front of the main house going up to the panhandle, build fences. The Rangers were involved in taking care of the last of the Apaches that were giving us problems. This guy, Victoria, was a chief, Muscalero. He took off in 1879. They had a lot of problems with them in West Texas and in northern Mexico. The U.S. cavalry was involved in trying to calm that down. The Rangers were also involved in it. And then when Victoria was killed, this guy Geronimo took over, and he continued the fight for a long time. And Rangers were involved in finally bringing that to an end. This guy Gillette, in 1879, he led a group of 12 Rangers, again, totally illegally, but he took them across the river and was chasing Victoria down. So if you know anything about the Texas Rangers, you know this legend that says one riot, one ranger. That was created in 1896. They wanted to have a world's heavyweight championship fight in El Paso. It was illegal. The mayor tried to stop the fight. The people wanted to fight. So they had a big fuss over whether there's going to be a fight or not. The mayor of El Paso called for a ranger and one win, Bill McDonald. He got off of the train and met the mayor. The mayor says, "Where are the others?" McDonald said, "Hell, I ain't enough. Ain't I enough? There's only one prize fight." And so one riot, one ranger came out of that. Now, they did have the prize fight. They moved it to Langtree, which is where the Pecos River runs into Rio Grande. And there was a sandbar in the middle of the Rio Grande, and they actually had that prize fight on the sandbar. All right, in 1832, Ma Ferguson is elected governor. The Rangers supported her opponent. She didn't like that. She fired every one of them. Put political appointees in place, and they didn't do a really good job. So Texas became a place where outlaws thought they could get away from stuff. So we had all these gangs, Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, Pretty Boy Floyd. They all came to Texas because we didn't have good law. But Bonnie and Clyde were a particular problem. Bonnie was born in Rowena, Clyde near Dallas. They met in Dallas. Clyde was just a bad guy. He kept creating felonies. He was in prison twice. And in 1832, he forms a gang. And Bonnie is his now girlfriend. She's with him and some others. And they were robbing banks and excuse me, doing all kinds of bad stuff. They murdered at least 9 police officers and 3 civilians in this period of time. And of course, the whole state wanted to get rid of Bonnie and Clyde. They finally convinced Ma that the only way to do that was to hire Frank Hamer. He had been the head of the Texas Rangers, ranger for a career. He was one of them that was fired. So they convinced Ma to hire him back. They hired him as a highway patrolman, and they sent him out to hunt for Bonnie and Clyde. It didn't take him but a few months, and he found them. He ambushed them in Louisiana as they drove by in a car, and he and some other guys shot the car full of machine guns. That's the car. We still have it today. So Bonnie and Clyde were killed. Frank Hamer lived in Austin. He died here in 1955. If you want to see the story of Frank Hamer and Bonnie and Clyde, look at the movie The Highwayman on Netflix. It's really good. And it tells her story. So in 1935, Ma's term expires. They created the Department of Public Safety. The Rangers are reincorporated in the DPS, where they still are today. They're a unit of the DPS today. One last guy I want to talk about, Alfred Ali. 4 generations of Alis were Texas Rangers. I had the distinct privilege of having this man tell me his story about Carrizo Springs. There's a picture of him in 1939. They had horses, they didn't have to ride their horse everywhere. They could put them in a trailer and take them where they're going. So 1969, Carrizo Springs has a jailhouse. The prisoners revolted. Somehow they got out of their cells, they came down, they ran the cops off, they took over the prison. They called the Rangers in. Well, Ali showed up, and they get in a big gunfight. And Ali takes his Thompson submachine gun, and he runs in the bottom door of the jail. All the bad guys are up on the second floor. Ali turns his machine gun on full blast, runs up the steps to the second floor. Bullets are flying everywhere. And when he emerged on the second floor, all of the prisoners are under their beds. And the fight is over with. And that's Captain Alfred Ali. Here's modern Rangers. We still have them today. They all wear a hat, they wear boots, and they all wear a badge. They're mostly involved in criminal investigations. They provide support to law groups around the state. Once in a while, if there's a critical incident or an active shooter, they might get called to duty, but that doesn't happen very often. So that's the Rangers today. Now, 1988, they hired Leroy Young. That's the first black man to be a Ranger. And lo and behold, finally, in 2008, they hired the first woman. Wendy Wakeman was the first, well, was the first woman Texas Ranger. They made her a major 2 years ago. So there's the modern Texas Rangers. There are numerous books that you can read about the Rangers. And I'll say again, this one by Prescott Webb is, in my opinion, the best one. There's a Hall of Ranger Museum up here in Waco if you ever get a chance. It's really well done if you like that kind of stuff. They've got good exhibits, so you can go to Waco and see the Hall of Fame Museum. And that's the Texas Ranger story. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to try to field any questions.
Jim, how big a force is it now?
I'm sorry, Stuart, I didn't hear you.
How big a force? How many members are in the Rangers?
Oh, how many Rangers are there today?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think there's a whole lot of them because they're not everywhere. So I don't know how many there are today, but there are several of them.
Only takes one.
You know, one riot, one injured. That's all it takes. Okay, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.